David Thompson had been sitting on the same bench for 3 years, but tonight felt different. The empty bottle rolled between his fingers as he stared at the exact spot where everything changed, where the screech of brakes still echoed in his dreams. "You look sad, mister." The small voice cut through the December air like a blade. A 6-year-old girl with braided hair stood before him, her eyes too knowing for her age. "You want to meet my mommy? She's right there." Emma pointed to the empty bench across from him. David's blood turned to ice. There was no one there, just shadows and the ghost of his own guilt. "She says you smell like that night," Emma continued, tilting her head with innocent curiosity. "The night the green truck came." "Mister, why are you shaking?" David Thompson wiped his trembling hands on his work uniform, the fluorescent security guard badge catching the dim streetlight. 3 years of late-night shifts at the warehouse, 3 years of avoiding sleep, 3 years of this exact routine. Park bench at 11 p.m., cheap whiskey until his hand stopped shaking, then stumble home to his empty apartment. But tonight, a child had appeared like some kind of Christmas ghost, talking to invisible people and mentioning green trucks. The little girl couldn't be more than 6, wearing a pink winter coat that had seen better days and mittens with holes in the thumbs. Her dark hair was braided with the kind of precision that spoke of a grandmother's careful hands. She stood there, completely unafraid of a strange man drinking alone in the dark, chatting away to an empty bench as if her mother were actually sitting there. "Mommy works at the hospital," Emma explained, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "She takes care of people who are hurt, but she's been really tired lately." The child turned back to the empty bench, nodding seriously at whatever conversation she was having in her head. "Oh, okay, Mommy, I'll tell him." She looked back at David with those unsettling dark eyes. "She wants to know if you have kids." David's mouth went dry. The question hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of Jake's angry voice on the phone just that morning. "Don't call me anymore, Dad. I'm done pretending you care." His 16-year-old son had every right to hate him. The divorce, the drinking, the accident that David had never told anyone about, it had all piled up until there was nothing left between them but bitter silence. "Yeah," David managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I got a boy. He's better off without me." The admission tasted like poison, but something about this strange little girl made him want to tell the truth for once. Maybe it was the way she looked at him without judgment, or maybe it was the whiskey talking. Either way, the words came out before he could stop them. Emma tilted her head again, listening to her invisible mother. "She says that's not true. She says boys need their daddies, even when they're angry." The child's matter-of-fact delivery made David's chest tighten. "My daddy went away before I was born. Mommy says he probably had his reasons, but I still wonder about him sometimes." The irony wasn't lost on David. Here he was, a father who had abandoned his responsibilities, talking to a little girl whose father had done the same thing. But there was something else nagging at him. Something about the way Emma described her mother's work at the hospital, the tiredness, the late nights. It reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. "What's your mommy's name, sweetheart?" The question slipped out before David could think better of it. Something about this whole situation felt familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. "Maria Santos," Emma said proudly. "She's the best nurse in the whole world." Well, she was. The past tense hung in the air like a death sentence. "She doesn't work there anymore, 'cause she's with me now, right here." Emma gestured again to the empty bench, and David felt his world start to tilt sideways. Maria Santos. The name hit him like a freight train, bringing back the newspaper clipping he'd kept hidden in his wallet for 3 years. Local nurse dies in hit-and-run accident. The photo had shown a young woman with kind eyes and Emma's same dark hair, crossing the street after her shift at Mercy General Hospital. The article mentioned she was a single mother, survived by her daughter and her parents. David had read that clipping so many times the paper had started to disintegrate. His hands began shaking again, and this time it had nothing to do with alcohol withdrawal. This little girl, this impossible, chattering little girl who saw her dead mother sitting on park benches, was the daughter of the woman David had killed with his truck 3 years ago, the woman whose life he'd ended in a split second of drunk driving and cowardice. "You okay, mister?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you saw a ghost or something." She giggled at her own joke, completely unaware that she'd just described exactly what was happening to David's sanity. David forced himself to breathe, to think, to not run screaming into the night like every instinct was telling him to do. This was impossible. What were the odds that the daughter of his victim would approach him, of all people, in a park 3 years later? What kind of cosmic joke was this? "I'm fine, kiddo," he lied, his voice barely steady. Just surprised to meet someone new. You shouldn't be out here alone this late, though. Where are your grandparents?" He needed to get her away from him, needed to end this conversation before his guilt wrote itself all over his face in permanent ink. "Oh, they're at home. They think I'm sleeping," Emma said with the casual admission of a child who didn't understand the concept of getting in trouble. "But I can't sleep when Mommy's here. She only comes to visit at night, you see. During the day she has to help other people who are hurt." The innocent explanation made David want to throw up. Other people who were hurt. Like the people David had been hurting for 3 years by living with this secret. Like his son Jake, who was angry and confused because his father had become a ghost of himself after the accident. Like Maria Santos's parents, who probably still wondered why the driver had never been caught, never been punished, never even had the decency to face what he'd done. "Emma!" The sharp voice cut through the night air like a blade. An elderly man in a thick coat was hurrying across the park, his face a mixture of worry and exasperation. "Emma, what are you doing out here? Your grandmother is worried sick." The little girl's face fell. "Hi, Grandpa. I was just talking to Mommy. And this nice man." She gestured toward David, who suddenly felt like he was wearing a neon sign that said, "Guilty," in flashing letters. The man, Roberto Santos, David realized with growing horror, looked at him with the kind of suspicion any grandfather would have for a stranger talking to his granddaughter at night. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made David's blood freeze. Recognition. Not of David specifically, but of the type of man he was. The smell of alcohol, the shaking hands, the general air of someone running from something. "Thank you for keeping her safe," Roberto said carefully, his accent thick with decades of careful English. "She sometimes wanders. Since her mother died, she has these episodes." The older man's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and David felt another piece of his soul die. "No problem," David managed, standing up quickly and shoving his hands in his pockets to hide their trembling. "She's a sweet kid. You should probably get her home, though. It's getting cold." Roberto nodded, reaching for Emma's hand. But the little girl pulled back, looking between the two men with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Grandpa, Mommy says this man needs help. She says he's carrying something heavy and it's making him sick." The words hit David like a physical blow. He could feel Roberto's eyes on him, studying his face, looking for answers to questions the old man probably didn't even know he should be asking. This was it. This was where it all fell apart, where the truth came spilling out in a park at midnight, in front of the very people he'd wronged most. But Roberto just nodded sadly and took Emma's hand. "Come on, mija. Your mommy would want you to be safe and warm at home." He looked back at David one more time, and there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "Take care of yourself, son. Whatever you're running from, it'll catch up eventually. It always does." David watched them walk away, the old man's words echoing in his head like a prophecy. Emma turned back once, waving at both David and the empty bench where she believed her mother was sitting. "Bye, Mommy. Bye, sad man. I hope you feel better." And then they were gone, leaving David alone with his guilt and the growing certainty that this encounter was far from over. Because Emma Santos, the daughter of the woman he'd killed, had found him. And somehow, impossibly, she wanted to help him. The question was, what was he going to do about it? David stumbled home that night, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. His apartment was a shrine to his own self-pity. Empty beer bottles, unpaid bills, and the divorce papers he'd never bothered to sign scattered across every surface. On his nightstand sat the one photo he hadn't thrown away. Jake at 10 years old, grinning gap-toothed after hitting his first home run. He pulled out his phone and stared at his son's contact information. Jake lived with his mother across town now, in the nice suburb David used to be able to afford before he'd lost his trucking job and started drinking away his savings. They hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since Jake had finally exploded about David's drinking and accused him of caring more about his bottles than his own family. The kid wasn't wrong. After the accident, David had crawled so far into a bottle that he'd forgotten how to be a father. How could he explain to his son that he was drowning in guilt over killing someone? How could he admit that every time he looked at Jake, he saw another family torn apart by his selfishness? His phone buzzed with a text message, and for a wild moment David thought it might be Jake. Instead, it was his court-appointed lawyer, reminding him about the hearing next week. Some family was suing the city over inadequate street lighting, claiming it had contributed to their daughter's death in a hit-and-run accident 3 years ago. David's lawyer was confident they could get him off if he just stuck to his story about swerving to avoid an animal. David stared at the message until the words blurred together. The Santos family was fighting for justice for their daughter, and here he was, hiding behind legal technicalities and outright lies. The thought made him sick, but not sick enough to come forward. Not yet. The next evening, David found himself back at the park. He told himself he was just maintaining his routine, that seeing Emma the night before had been a fluke, but deep down, he knew he was hoping to see her again. There was something about the child's simple acceptance of impossible things that made him feel less alone with his guilt. She appeared again just after 11, slipping through the shadows like a small ghost in her pink coat. This time she brought something with her. A small toy truck, painted green and worn smooth by countless hours of play. "Look what I brought," Emma announced, holding up the truck as she settled onto her usual bench. "Mommy gave this to me for my birthday. She said it was important." The child began rolling the truck back and forth across the bench, making soft engine noises under her breath. David's blood turned to ice water. The truck was the exact same make and model as the one he'd been driving the night of the accident. The same forest green collar, the same distinctive grille, even the same company logo on the side. It couldn't be a coincidence. That's a nice truck," David managed, his voice sounding strangled to his own ears. Emma beamed at him. "Mommy says it reminds her of something important, something about forgiveness and making things right." She continued playing with the truck, completely oblivious to the fact that David looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Emma," David said carefully, "what else does your mommy tell you? About the night she got hurt?" The little girl stopped playing and looked at the empty space beside her on the bench. After a moment, she nodded seriously. "She says there was a man who was very sad and scared. She says he didn't mean to hurt anybody, but he made a big mistake. And then, he got even more scared and ran away." David's hands were shaking so badly now that he had to clasp them together to keep them still. "What else?" "She says the man has a little boy who misses him very much. She says the little boy doesn't understand why his daddy became so sad all the time." Emma looked directly at David with those two knowing dark eyes. "She says forgiveness has to start somewhere, and maybe it starts with telling the truth." The words hit David like a sledgehammer. This was impossible. 6-year-old children didn't talk like this, didn't understand concepts like forgiveness and redemption. Either Emma Santos was the most extraordinary child who had ever lived, or David was having a complete psychological breakdown. At this point, he wasn't sure which option scared him more. "I have to go," David said abruptly, standing up so fast that he nearly fell over. I have work." But Emma wasn't done with him yet. "Wait," she called, holding up the toy truck. "Mommy wants you to have this. She says you'll know what to do with it when the time comes." David stared at the truck in the child's outstretched hand. Taking it would be admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. It would be accepting responsibility for something he'd spent 3 years running from. But looking into Emma's earnest face, he found himself reaching out and taking the small toy anyway. The moment his fingers closed around it, David felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't peace. He was nowhere near ready for that. But it was the first crack in the wall he'd built around his guilt. And sometimes, cracks were where the light got in. "Thank you," he whispered. And for the first time in 3 years, he meant it. Emma smiled and skipped away into the darkness, leaving David alone with a toy truck and the growing certainty that his carefully constructed world of lies was about to come crashing down around him. The next morning, David called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of sleeping off his hangover, he found himself driving across town to the suburb where his ex-wife lived with Jake. He hadn't planned to actually knock on the door. Just seeing the house where his son lived was usually enough to remind him why he needed to stay away. But today was different. Today he had a green toy truck sitting on his passenger seat, and Emma Santos's words echoing in his head about little boys who missed their daddies. Jake answered the door wearing basketball shorts and a scowl that could have cut glass. At 16 he was almost as tall as David now, with his mother's blonde hair and his father's stubborn jaw. He looked healthy and strong and absolutely nothing like a kid who needed his deadbeat dad messing up his life. "What do you want?" Jake's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who had given up expecting anything good from the person standing in front of him. "I wanted to see you," David said, the words coming out more honestly than he'd intended. "I wanted to talk." "About what? About how you've been drunk for 3 years? About how you missed my birthday again? Or maybe about how Mom cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking?" Jake's voice was getting louder, angrier, and David could see the neighbors starting to take notice. "Jake, please, can we go somewhere and talk, just for a few minutes?" For a moment, it looked like Jake might slam the door in his face. But then something shifted in the teenager's expression. Not forgiveness, but maybe a flicker of curiosity. "Fine, but not here. I don't want Mom to see you and get upset." They ended up at a diner 10 minutes away, sitting in a booth that had seen better days and drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. Jake stared out the window while David tried to figure out how to start a conversation with the son who had every reason to hate him. "I met a little girl," David said finally, because apparently his mouth had decided to operate independently of his brain. "She reminded me of you when you were little, before everything went wrong," Jake snorted. "Everything went wrong when you decided beer was more important than your family." The words stung because they were true, but David pressed on. "She lost her mom in an accident, a hit and run. And she still believes, she still has hope, that things can get better, that people can change." "Good for her," Jake said, still not looking at his father. "Must be nice to be that naive." David reached into his pocket and pulled out the toy truck, setting it on the table between them. Jake's eyes flicked to it, and something changed in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or confusion? "Where'd you get that?" Jake's voice was quieter now, uncertain. "The little girl gave it to me. She said—" David swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "She said it was about forgiveness, about making things right." Jake was staring at the truck now, his teenage mask of indifference starting to crack. "Dad, that looks exactly like the truck you used to drive, the one from your old job." He looked up at David with sudden understanding. "The job you lost right after you started drinking, right after you got weird and distant and stopped caring about anything." David felt his carefully constructed wall of lies beginning to crumble. Jake was smart. Too smart. He was putting pieces together that David had never wanted anyone to connect. "Jake," David said carefully, "what if I told you that there was something I'd done? Something terrible, that I've been too scared to face?" His son leaned back in the booth, studying David's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "I'd say it's about time you told someone. Whatever it is, it's been eating you alive for 3 years. And there it was. The opening David had been too terrified to create for himself. His 16-year-old son, angry and hurt and disappointed, was still willing to listen, was still willing to give him one more chance to be honest. "The night everything changed," David began, his voice barely above a whisper. I was driving home from work. I'd been drinking. Not a lot, but enough that I shouldn't have been behind the wheel. And there was this woman. Jake's face went very still, very pale. Dad, what did you do? I hit her, David said, and saying the words out loud felt like pulling a knife out of his own chest. I hit her with my truck, and I was so scared, so drunk and terrified that I drove away. I left her there to die. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at his father like he was seeing him for the first time, and David could practically see the teenager's worldview rearranging itself around this new, terrible information. You killed someone, Jake said finally, his voice hollow with shock. Yeah, and you never told anyone. No, and you've been drinking yourself to death over it for 3 years instead of doing the right thing. David nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Jake was quiet for a long time, turning the toy truck over in his hands like it might hold answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. The little girl, Jake said slowly, the one who gave you this truck. She's the daughter, isn't she? The daughter of the woman you killed. David nodded again, and Jake made a sound that was part laugh, part sob. Jesus, Dad, only you would find a way to make this even more complicated. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and when he looked at David again, there was something different in his expression. Not forgiveness, they weren't there yet, but maybe the beginning of understanding. What are you going to do? Jake asked. I don't know, David admitted. I've been running from it for so long, I don't know how to stop. Jake was quiet for another long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the toy truck. You know what I think? I think that little girl giving you this wasn't an accident. I think maybe it's time to stop running. Jake, if I turn myself in, I'll go to prison. I'll lose my job, what's left of my savings, everything. Dad, Jake said quietly, you've already lost everything. The only question is whether you're going to lose your soul too. The words hit David like a physical blow because they were absolutely, devastatingly true. He had lost everything that mattered. His family, his self-respect, his ability to sleep at night without drowning in guilt. The only thing he had left was the truth, and he'd been too much of a coward to face even that. Would you? David's voice cracked, and he had to start again. If I did the right thing, would you be able to forgive me? Eventually, Jake considered this, turning the toy truck over in his hands one more time before setting it back on the table. I think I could forgive you for the accident, Dad. Accidents happen, even when people make stupid choices. But I don't know if I can forgive you for lying about it for 3 years, for letting an innocent family suffer while you hid like a coward. The brutal honesty of it took David's breath away, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. Jake wasn't going to make this easy for him, wasn't going to offer him absolution he hadn't earned, but he was offering him something else, a chance to earn back his respect, one honest choice at a time. What if I told you I was scared? David asked. What if I told you that every day for 3 years I've wanted to come forward, but I was too terrified of losing you completely? Then I'd tell you that you already lost me, Jake said simply. The day you chose to protect yourself instead of doing what was right, but that doesn't mean you can't get me back. David reached across the table and touched his son's hand. Jake didn't pull away, which felt like a small miracle. Help me, David whispered. Help me figure out how to do this right. Jake squeezed his father's hand, and for the first time in 3 years, David felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone with his guilt anymore. Okay, Dad, Jake said quietly. But we do this together. No more lies, no more running. If you're going to face this, you're going to face it like a man. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was hope. And sometimes, hope was enough to start with. Over the next week, David and Jake met every evening to plan what Jake called Operation Actually Be a Decent Human Being. It was Jake's gallows humor way of dealing with the enormity of what they were preparing to do, and David was grateful for his son's strength in a situation where he felt completely lost. They researched lawyers who specialized in delayed confessions, looked into victims' rights organizations, and tried to figure out how to approach the Santos family with the truth. Jake insisted on being involved in every detail, and David found himself both grateful for and terrified by his son's determination to see this through. "We need to tell them first," Jake said on Thursday evening as they sat in David's apartment, surrounded by legal documents and printouts about restorative justice. "Before you go to the police, before you call a lawyer, we need to tell the family. They deserve to hear it from you, not from some court proceeding." David's stomach churned at the thought. "Jake, I don't know if I can look them in the eye and tell them what I did." "Then you're not ready to do this," Jake said bluntly. "If you can't face the people you hurt, then you're just looking for another way to make this about you instead of about them." The criticism stung, but David knew his son was right. Emma's grandparents deserved to know the truth, deserved to hear it from the person who had shattered their world. But the thought of seeing that kind of pain in Roberto Santos's eyes made David want to crawl into a bottle and never come out. On Friday night, David found himself back at the park, hoping to see Emma one more time before he changed everything. He needed to see her face, to remember why he was doing this. She appeared just after 11, as if she'd been waiting for him. "Hi, sad man," Emma called out, skipping over to his bench. "Did you bring my truck?" David pulled the toy out of his pocket and handed it to her. "Actually, I wanted to give this back to you, but I also wanted to tell you something." Emma sat down beside him, cradling the truck in her small hands. "What is it?" "I'm going to tell your grandparents the truth about what happened to your mommy," David said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "It's going to be hard for them to hear, and they might be very angry with me." Emma nodded seriously. "Mommy says they'll be sad at first, but then they'll feel better. She says the truth is like medicine. It tastes terrible, but it helps you heal." David looked at the empty bench where Emma believed her mother was sitting. "What else does she say?" "She says thank you," Emma replied simply. "She says it takes a lot of courage to tell the truth when you're scared. And she says," Emma paused, tilting her head as if listening to something David couldn't hear. "She says she forgives you. She forgave you a long time ago." The words hit David like a lightning bolt, and he found himself sobbing in a way he hadn't cried since he was Emma's age. All the guilt, all the fear, all the self-hatred he'd been carrying for 3 years came pouring out of him in great, gasping waves. Emma patted his hand with the gentle authority of someone far older than her years. "It's okay to cry," she said. "Crying means you're ready to feel better." When David finally composed himself, he looked at Emma with wonder. "How are you so wise, little one?" Emma shrugged. "Mommy teaches me things. She says when people are hurt they need love, not more hurt. Even people who make mistakes." David nodded, wiping his eyes. "Will you do something for me, Emma? Will you tell your grandparents that someone wants to speak with them? Someone who has information about your mommy?" "Okay," Emma said, then paused. "Are you going to be okay when you tell them?" "I don't know," David admitted. "But I'm going to try to be brave, like your mommy was." Emma smiled and handed him back the toy truck. "Keep this for a little while longer. You might need it to remember to be brave." As Emma skipped away into the darkness, David felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, he wasn't ready for that yet, but determination. Tomorrow, he would call the Santos family. Tomorrow, he would begin the long process of making amends for the worst thing he'd ever done. And maybe, if he was very lucky, he would finally be able to look at himself in the mirror again. The next morning, David sat in his apartment with Jake beside him, staring at Roberto Santos's phone number written on a piece of paper. They'd found it in the phone book, R. Santos on Maple Street, the address listed in the newspaper article about Maria's death. "You ready?" Jake asked, his hand on his father's shoulder. David nodded, though his hands were shaking as he dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a heavily accented voice answered. "Hello, Mr. Santos? My name is David Thompson. I have some information about your daughter Maria's accident. Could we meet somewhere to talk?" There was a long pause, and David could hear Roberto's breathing change. "What kind of information?" "The kind that's better said in person. I know this is strange, but it's important. For your family and for Emma." At the mention of his granddaughter's name, Roberto's voice sharpened. How do you know Emma? I'll explain everything when we meet. Please, Mr. Santos, this is something you need to hear. Another long pause. Then, okay, but not here. Not where Emma might overhear. There's a coffee shop on 5th Street near the courthouse. Miguel's. Can you be there in an hour? Yes, David said. I'll be there. And Mr. Santos, I'm bringing my son with me for support. Bring whoever you need, Roberto said quietly. If this is about my Maria, I want to hear it. Miguel's coffee shop was exactly the kind of place David had expected. Small, family-owned, with the smell of fresh bread and strong coffee filling the air. Roberto Santos was already there when they arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee like it was an anchor. Miguel. He was smaller than David had expected, probably in his 60s, with calloused hands and kind eyes that were currently filled with wariness. When he saw David and Jake approaching, he stood up, and David could see the tension in every line of his body. Mr. Santos, David said, extending his hand. Thank you for meeting with us. Roberto shook his hand briefly, then gestured for them to sit. You said you had information about Maria. What kind of information? David looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Roberto. There was no easy way to do this, no gentle way to deliver the news that would change everything. Mr. Santos, David began, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. 3 years ago, on the night of December 15th, I was driving home from work. I'd been drinking, and I was driving a green pickup truck. And David's voice caught, but he forced himself to continue. I was the one who hit your daughter. I was the one who killed Maria. The silence that followed was deafening. Roberto stared at David with an expression that cycled through disbelief, understanding, and finally, a grief so raw that David had to look away. You, Roberto whispered, his voice breaking. You killed my baby girl and you just left her there to die? Yes, David said, tears streaming down his face. Yes, I did, and I've been living with that guilt every day since. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I know it doesn't bring her back, but I needed you to know. I needed you to know that it wasn't some stranger who didn't care. It was someone who has been destroyed by what he did, someone who thinks about Maria every single day. Roberto was crying now too, quiet tears that spoke of a grief that had never fully healed. Why? He asked. Why are you telling me this now? Why not 3 years ago? Because I was a coward, David said simply. Because I was scared of going to prison, scared of losing what little I had left. But I met Emma, and she changed something in me. She made me realize that some things are more important than being afraid. At the mention of his granddaughter, Roberto's expression shifted. Emma? How do you know Emma? David and Jake exchanged glances, and David realized they'd entered even stranger territory. She approached me in the park, Lincoln Park, where the accident happened. She was talking to her mother, to Maria, and she told me things that made me realize I had to stop running from what I'd done. Roberto stared at David for a long moment, then laughed. A bitter, broken sound. Emma talks to her mother every night. We've taken her to doctors, to therapists, but she insists Maria is there with her. We thought it was trauma, grief, manifesting in a child's mind. Maybe it is, David said quietly. Or maybe some things can't be explained. All I know is that Emma told me I needed to tell the truth, and she was right. Roberto was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup, like it might hold answers to questions he'd been asking for 3 years. When he finally looked up, his eyes were still filled with pain, but there was something else there too, something that might have been relief. What happens now? Roberto asked. Are you going to turn yourself in? Yes, David said. I'm going to call the police as soon as I leave here. I've contacted a lawyer, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. You and your family deserved that much. Roberto nodded slowly. You're right. We did deserve that. We deserved it 3 years ago. The criticism hit David like a slap, but he took it without flinching. You're absolutely right, And I know that nothing I do now can make up for the 3 years you've spent wondering, hoping for justice that seemed like it would never come. My wife, Roberto said quietly. She died 6 months ago. The stress, the grief over Maria, it was too much for her heart. She died never knowing who killed our daughter, never seeing justice for what was done to our family. The words hit David like a physical blow. Another life destroyed by his cowardice. Another person who had suffered because he'd been too selfish to face the consequences of his actions. "I'm sorry," David whispered, but the words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of such loss. "Sorry doesn't bring them back," Roberto said, but his voice wasn't angry anymore, just tired, bone-deep tired. "But maybe it's a start." Jake, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "Mr. Santos, I know this doesn't change anything, but my dad has been destroying himself over this for 3 years. He lost his job, his family, everything. Not because he deserves sympathy, but because what he did has consequences that go beyond just the people he hurt directly." Roberto looked at Jake with surprise, as if he'd forgotten the teenager was there. "You're his son?" "Yes, sir. And I've hated him for 3 years because I thought he'd just stopped caring about our family. I didn't know he was carrying this." Jake's voice was steady, but David could hear the emotion underneath. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. That's not my place. But I wanted you to know that telling you the truth today is the first brave thing he's done since the accident." Roberto studied Jake's face, and David could see him recognizing something there. The pain of a child who had lost a parent, even if that parent was still alive. "How old are you, son?" 16, the same age Emma will be in 10 years if she's lucky. Roberto's voice was soft, thoughtful. "Tell me something. Do you think your father is a good man who did a terrible thing? Or a terrible man who occasionally does good things?" Jake considered this carefully, and David held his breath, waiting for the answer. "I think he's a broken man who made the worst possible choice at the worst possible moment. But I also think he's trying to fix himself, even though it might be too late." Roberto nodded slowly. "And what do you think should happen to him?" "I think he should go to prison," Jake said without hesitation, "not because I want him to suffer, but because that's what justice looks like. Actions have consequences, and he needs to face them." The brutal honesty of his son's words made David's chest tighten. But he was also proud of Jake for speaking the truth, without trying to protect him. Roberto was quiet for another long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call my lawyer," he said. "Not to cause you more trouble, but because I want to make sure this is handled properly. 3 years is a long time to wait for justice, but I want to make sure we get it right." David nodded. "Whatever you need to do, Mr. Santos, I understand." "And I'm going to tell Emma," Roberto continued. "She's going to want to know why the sad man from the park isn't coming to visit anymore." "Actually," David said quietly, "I was hoping, after I get out of prison, whenever that is, I was hoping I might be able to help somehow. I know it sounds crazy, but Emma seems to think that her mother wants me to try to make amends somehow. I don't know what that would look like, but if there's ever anything your family needs," Roberto's expression was unreadable. "You want to help the family of the woman you killed. I want to try to make things right, if that's even possible. I know money can't bring Maria back, can't undo the pain I've caused, but maybe there's something I can do. For Emma's future, for her education, anything that might honor Maria's memory." "We'll see," Roberto said simply. "First, you need to face the consequences of what you did. Then maybe we can talk about what making amends actually looks like." David nodded, understanding that this was the most he could hope for. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but maybe, eventually, a chance to do something useful with his guilt. Roberto stood up, and David and Jake followed suit. "Mr. Thompson," Roberto said, extending his hand again. "I won't pretend this was easy to hear. But thank you for finally telling the truth. My Maria deserved that much." David shook the older man's hand, and, for just a moment, he felt something pass between them. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a shared understanding of what it meant to love someone and lose them. "Mr. Santos," David said, "will you tell Emma something for me? Will you tell her that the sad man is going to try to be brave like her mommy was?" Roberto's eyes softened slightly. "I'll tell her. And Mr. Thompson? That little girl talks to her mother every night. If Maria really is listening somehow, I think she'd want you to find a way to forgive yourself eventually. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday." With that, Roberto Santos walked out of the coffee shop, leaving David and Jake alone with the weight of what they'd just done. "You ready for the next part?" Jake asked quietly. David pulled out his phone and stared at the number for the police station. "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." "Good," Jake said, squeezing his father's shoulder. "That's what courage looks like." David dialed the number, and when the dispatcher answered, he took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I'd like to turn myself in for a hit-and-run accident that occurred 3 years ago. I killed someone, and I've been running from it ever since." 2 years later, David Thompson walked out of Millbrook Correctional Facility into the bright afternoon sunshine. He'd served 18 months of a 3-year sentence, with early release for good behavior, and his cooperation with the victim impact program he'd helped establish at the prison. Jake was waiting for him in the parking lot, taller now, more serious, but with the same stubborn jaw and his mother's eyes. At 18, he looked like a young man who had learned hard lessons about responsibility and redemption. "Dad," Jake said simply, pulling David into a hug that felt like coming home. "How's Emma?" were David's first words, because some things mattered more than his own freedom. "She's good. Really good, actually. She stopped seeing her mom about 6 months after you went in. Roberto says she told him that Maria said it was time to let go, that the sad man was learning to be happy again." David felt his throat tighten. Even after everything, that little girl was still looking out for him. "Roberto wants to see you," Jake continued. "Not today. He knows you need time to adjust, but soon. He has something he wants to discuss with you." Over the next few weeks, David slowly rebuilt his life. He found a job at a community center, helping to run programs for at-risk youth. It didn't pay much, but it felt like penance and purpose rolled into one. He attended AA meetings religiously, found a small apartment near Jake's college, and slowly learned how to sleep without drowning in guilt. When Roberto finally called, it was on a Thursday evening in late spring. They agreed to meet at the same coffee shop where David had confessed, because some conversations required familiar ground. Roberto looked older, more tired, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. They ordered coffee and sat in the same booth, but this time the silence between them was comfortable, rather than terrifying. "Emma's doing well in school," Roberto said eventually. "She's smart, like her mother. She wants to be a nurse when she grows up." David smiled. "Following in Maria's footsteps?" "Yes. She says she wants to help people who are hurt, just like her mommy did." Roberto paused, studying David's face. "She asks about you sometimes. She calls you the man who learned to be brave." The description made David's chest tighten with emotion. "She's an extraordinary little girl," she is. "And she's going to need help paying for college when the time comes. Her grandmother and we don't have much saved. We're getting older, and the medical bills from my wife's illness." Roberto trailed off, then looked directly at David. "You said you wanted to make amends. This is how you can do it." David nodded immediately. "Whatever Emma needs, college, books, anything. I've been saving everything I can since I got out. It's not much yet, but it's a start." "It's not about the money," Roberto said quietly. "It's about the intention. Maria would have wanted her daughter to have opportunities, to make something good out of all this pain." "Then that's what we'll do," David said. "We'll make sure Emma has every opportunity Maria would have wanted for her." Roberto reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and green, the toy truck Emma had given David all those years ago in the park. "She wanted you to have this back. She says her mommy told her that you don't need it to remember to be brave anymore." David took the truck with shaking hands, remembering that night in the park when Emma had first offered it to him. It seemed like a lifetime ago, back when he'd been drowning in guilt and self-pity. "There's something else," Roberto said. "Emma wants to meet with you. Not to talk about the accident, not to make you feel guilty. She just She wants to see how you're doing. She says her mommy wants to make sure you're okay." The thought of seeing Emma again, not as the man who killed her mother, but as someone who was trying to build something good from the wreckage of his mistakes, filled David with a mixture of joy and terror. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" David asked. "I think," Roberto said slowly, "that little girl has been carrying other people's pain for too long. She deserves to see that the sad man from the park found his way back to being happy. And you deserve to see that not everything you touched was destroyed." They arranged to meet the following Saturday at Lincoln Park, the same park where everything had started, where Emma had first approached a broken man on a bench and somehow seen past his guilt to the person he could become. Emma was 8 now, taller and more serious, but with the same dark eyes and the same intuitive wisdom that had shaken David's world 3 years earlier. She ran to him when she saw him, wrapping her small arms around his waist in a hug that felt like absolution. "You look different," she said, stepping back to study his face. "You look lighter." David laughed, surprised by how accurate her observation was. "I feel lighter, like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and I finally learned how to put it down." "Mommy says you've been helping other people now, people who made mistakes, like you did." David nodded. "I work with kids and adults who are trying to figure out how to make better choices. It doesn't undo what I did, but maybe it prevents someone else from making the same mistakes." Emma considered this seriously, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, a drawing she'd made in crayon of 3 stick figures standing together under a rainbow. "This is for you," she said. "It's me and you and my mommy. She's not sad anymore, and neither are you." David took the drawing with hands that only trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of a child who had every reason to hate him, but had chosen love instead. "Emma," David said quietly, "I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to your mommy, but for all the sadness it caused you and your grandparents. I can't change what happened, but I promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." Emma nodded solemnly. "I know. Mommy told me that sometimes the best people are the ones who made the biggest mistakes and learned from them. She says you're going to help lots of people because you understand what it's like to be lost." "What else does your mommy say?" David asked, half afraid of the answer. Emma smiled, the first truly carefree smile he'd seen from her. "She says thank you, and she says she's proud of you for choosing to be brave, and she says—" Emma paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "She says it's okay to let go now, all of us. It's okay to let go and be happy." David felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked tight for 3 years finally breaking open. Not guilt, not pain, but something that felt suspiciously like peace. "Will you tell her something for me?" David asked. "Tell her that I'll take care of you, not instead of her, but because of her. Because she taught me that love is stronger than guilt, and forgiveness is stronger than fear." Emma nodded seriously, then broke into another smile. "She says she already knows. She says that's what mothers do. They teach people how to love even after they're gone." As David watched Emma skip back to her grandfather, he felt the last piece of his broken heart click back into place. He would never stop missing the life he'd destroyed with his choices, would never stop working to make amends for the pain he'd caused, but for the first time in 3 years, he could imagine a future where his guilt served a purpose, where his mistakes became the foundation for something good. Jake appeared beside him, having waited patiently while David and Emma had their conversation. "How do you feel?" his son asked. David looked at the drawing in his hands, at Emma laughing with her grandfather, at the son who had chosen to stand by him even when he didn't deserve it. "I feel like maybe," David said slowly, "maybe it's okay to start believing in second chances." "Good," Jake said, wrapping an arm around his father's shoulders, "because Emma's not the only one who deserves to see you happy." As they walked away from the park together, father and son, both of them older and wiser and more broken than they'd been 3 years ago, but also more whole, David felt something he hadn't experienced since the night everything changed. He felt hope, and sometimes hope was enough to build a new life on.